Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of TrekWars at OSU. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of exploitation, oppression, domination, war, and empire. One of the projects that we maintain at the Anarres Project is this one, TrekWars at OSU, in which we examine sci-fi and fantasy universes such as Star Trek and Star Wars to help us make sense of developments in our current political, social, economic, and cultural life. Today, an episode about the latest Star Trek series, Lower Decks. This series has gotten a lot of critical examination. Some critics have really downplayed this series by saying that the jokes are cheap, while the animation is really fantastic and interesting, the storylines are thin. And so it's gotten mixed reviews from both critics and fans. I really like this series. Part of the reason that I like it is because I think that it tells some really interesting stories that have continuity with the rest of the Star Trek universe. And in fact, I think that there are some lessons in the series that we can see that have to deal with how Star Trek deals particularly with technology. In some ways, Lower Decks does continue certain themes and ways of thinking about technology in the Star Trek universe. But I think that there are some lessons from Lower Decks that are really innovative and interesting and that match on to some philosophical understandings of the role of technology in our society. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about two particular episodes, some of the most recent ones. So episode 6, Terminal Provocations, and episode 7, Much Ado About Boimler. Now, if you haven't seen Lower Decks yet, let me just warn you that I'm going to be talking about some of these episodes, and there's going to be spoilers involved in some of the narratives. And so if you haven't seen this, you might want to avoid engaging in this conversation. But if you have seen it, what I'm going to try to do is to show the continuity of the way that these episodes talk about technology and science and how this relates to some of the other Star Trek series. And then also the lessons that we can learn from Lower Decks about the role of technology in our society. So the talk today is about tech on the Lower Decks. Right, so if you're not familiar with Star Trek Lower Decks yet, this is the animated series that takes place in the year 2380 aboard the USS Cerritos. The idea here is that this series focuses not on the main bridge crew in the ways in which other series have done in Star Trek by focusing on the captain and the first officer and so forth. Here we're looking at some of the lowest officers in this rather kind of middle of the line ship, the USS Cerritos. The characters here are Beckett Mariner, Bradward Boimler, Devon Attendee, and Sam Rutherford. So the idea here is to talk about Star Trek from a perspective in which we have rarely ever seen in the Star Trek universe, except for that one episode in The Next Generation called Lower Decks. And so this is inspired directly from that episode in which we're looking at the operations of the starship from some of the people on the lowest peg. So as I said, I want to talk about the storylines in episodes 6 and 7 that have to do with making and building technology. And so I'm going to talk about some of these stories and show how they have some kinds of similarities to one another, and then their relationships to stories in other Star Trek series that have to do with the way in which we as humans interact with technology in very interesting ways. So the first episode that I want to talk about is episode 6, Terminal Provocations. And the storyline they're having to deal with Rutherford and Tendi. Now, what happens in this episode in Terminal Provocations is that Tendi, who is the Orion's medical science officer, tells Rutherford that she has not really developed skill in traveling, in doing sort of spacewalking. And so he tells her that he has developed an instructional hologram that will allow people to be able to receive various kinds of trainings. And so she's very excited about the possibility of learning how to spacewalk in this new holosuite program that Rutherford has created. And so he takes her to the holosuite, and he introduces her to the interface with his program that he has named Badgie. And so Tendi immediately falls in love with this creature that sort of resembles the Microsoft paperclip that is meant to be the interface for the program. It asks you what you want to learn and how you want to sort of experience the training program. Now, as often goes wrong with holosuite episodes, right? Something goes wrong and the safety protocols are disabled on the program, and Badgie, rather than being a friendly, lovable character, turns into a murderous, frightening stalker character. And so, rather than him being helpful and useful, he tries to murder Rutherford and Tendi. What's interesting about this, as we find out, is that the reason that Rutherford built this program and built Badgie, we find out at the end, was that he wanted to impress Tendi. He has developed a bit of a crush on her, so to speak, and wanted to build something that would show his ability to code a holosuite program and to impress her. And so he develops this program out of a sense of insecurity, sort of a kind of a need to show off to her, because he felt that perhaps he needed to really impress her with his abilities. What's interesting about this story, in one hand, is that factor about the motivations that Rutherford had in building the program in the first place, but also in the telling of the story. What's really significant is that Badgie tries to kill Tendi and Rutherford in various scenarios, but one of the scenarios that Rutherford chooses in order to try to defeat Badgie and to try to prevent them from killing him and Tendi is this Arctic wasteland. And what's really funny about this, and I've seen that some people have noticed this, but not a lot, is that this is a direct call to the sort of origins of sci-fi, horror, and fantasy, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's a really significant scene in which Rutherford confronts the murderous Badgie and has this really violent, right? Violent for Star Trek, right? There's blood, there's bone splitting, right? It's quite scary. And of course, this recalls the beginning and the ending of the novel of Frankenstein, in which Dr. Frankenstein, confronts the monster in the Arctic and tries to murder him for killing all of his friends and family. And so there's a direct sort of reference to the origins, in some sense, of the work that sort of has created the genre of sci-fi and fantasy. And so that's an interesting sort of meta part of this story, of this episode. But what I want us to notice is the motivations that Rutherford had for building Badgie in the first place, right? Was this kind of need, a feeling of inadequacy, and wanting to compensate that by showing off. You find this in another storyline in episode 6, Terminal Provocations, with the story of Ensign Fletcher. Ensign Fletcher is a friend of Brad Boimler's from the Academy. And you see Boimler and Beckett Mariner, all three of them represented here, having interactions at the beginning of the episode, and Fletcher is sort of a large goofball character, but very sweet, very thoughtful at the beginning. And during the episode 6, there's a situation in which Fletcher, Boimler, and Mariner have to do some routine work of replacing data chips in data cores, and it becomes very, very tedious work. And Boimler and Fletcher decide that they are going to miss out on a leisure activity that they really wanted to get to, and Fletcher sort of urges them to go on ahead, that he can handle the job. Well, it turns out he can't. And in his feelings of inadequacy and competence, what he tries to do is to increase his intellectual abilities by plugging himself directly into a data core. And so he pulls out one of the data cores from the wall and he plugs it into a helmet, and it sort of zaps him in the head. His hope was, of course, to try to make himself more intelligent, more capable of doing the work. The result, however, is not that he is improved, but instead that the data core is corrupted. And as you see here in this slide, the data core turns into this murderous machine that tries to assimilate technology and to kill Boimler and Fletcher and Mariner. And in the end, Boimler and Fletcher and Mariner are able to defeat this murderous machine by sending it out an airlock. And sending it out into space. So they're able to protect the Cerritos. Of course, another ship is destroyed by this murderous machine. But here, what's really interesting about this story is that Fletcher admits that the reason that he did this was because he felt inadequate. He felt that he was not as smart as Boimler and Mariner, and he isn't. And in fact, his motivations are quite ethically suspicious too. It turns out that he's not as a good a guy as he seemed to be at the beginning. He's petty, he is guilt-ridden, he's shameful, he's a liar, and he's incompetent. And in fact, he knows all of these things, and that's part of the reason why he tried to use technology to improve himself. But the technology that he was using was to try to cover up these feelings of inadequacy that he had. Now, this kind of storyline about technology going awry because of the inadequacies of the creators is something that goes back to the storyline in the original series about Richard Daystrom, the episode The Ultimate Computer. This is one of my favorite episodes, storyline by the great D.C. Fontana, one of the sort of big writers and I think intellectual foundations of the Star Trek universe. But in The Ultimate Computer, we meet Richard Daystrom here, who at a very young age made these amazing developments in computer technology, developed the positronic brain that later was something that would find its way into the development of Lieutenant Commander Data in the Next Generation. But in The Ultimate Computer, he develops this computer called M5, and Starfleet decides to try to use M5 to replace Starfleet crews on Constellation class starships like the Enterprise. And so what you see in The Ultimate Computer is the effects of M5 taking over the ship, and it all goes awry, of course. M5 is not able to function effectively, and in fact it turns murderous. It's not able to really make a distinction between friends and foes, and so in a simulated war game between the Enterprise and several other Constitution class starships, it fires full force upon them and disables a couple of them, killing dozens of innocent crew members. It turns out that the reason that M5 had all of these kinds of problems was because it had really disastrous programming. Richard Daystrom admits that part of the reason that it was able to compute so well and so quickly was because he was able to imprint some of his own brain engrams into the computer. And it turns out that he is a really psychologically flawed character. He is insecure, he's vain, he's prideful, narcissistic. And so all of these personality flaws are built into the computer, making it unable to make moral decisions. And ultimately, Captain Kirk is able to defeat it in the way that he does most artificial intelligence, by getting it to recognize contradictions in its behavior. But part of it is because M5 operates in this kind of narcissistic, psychotic way. Daystrom has a breakdown at the end of the episode, and essentially that's what M5 was doing. So here again, in the same way that you have with the stories of Fletcher, and perhaps even a little bit with the stories of Rutherford, you see stories of creators building technology that goes awry, largely because the motivations going into the building of that technology were coming from places of insecurity or incompetence or fear. Of course, this kind of storyline plays a big part in the second season of Star Trek Discovery. Right, in Star Trek Discovery, we're dealing with the remnants of the Klingon War that was part of season 1, and in season 2, at the beginning you start to see that Section 31 has developed this artificial intelligence program called Control, which is being used as a threat assessment program. And because in some sense the Federation Starfleet felt that it was inadequately prepared for the threat of the Klingon War, and so it wanted to develop a system that would be able to analyze threats much more effectively. The Control program is so effective that it starts to think of most carbon-based sentient life as a threat to the security of the galaxy, and it starts to assimilate various members of the Federation to try to, in some sense, take over the galaxy to ensure complete control and security, right? And here you see, right, Captain Leland, who was a captain in Section 31, who was thoroughly assimilated by Control to become a villain, and you have this really tragic story of Lieutenant Commander Ariel, who, as a cyborg, was completely taken over in her programming by interfacing with Control. And at the end, of course, Discovery has to flee some 900 years into the future to get away from the remnants, if any, left of Control in the Starfleet Prime universe. And so here again, you see this kind of murderous technology that is developed primarily because of conceptions of fear, inadequacy, of a sense of not being in control of one's life. And that when technology is built with these kinds of motivations and these kinds of feelings in them, something is going to go wrong with them, in the same way that Rutherford's Badgie goes murderous because he's really coming from a place of vanity, pride, right? Rutherford's pride and vanity because of his wanting to impress Tending so much. Fletcher and the Data Corps, again, a story of incompetence, insecurity. Same thing with Daystrom, same thing with Control. So I think that this is, all of these stories actually really recall again Frankenstein, right? At Frankenstein, the monster is a monster largely because of the moral inadequacies of Dr. Frankenstein, right? The monster only becomes murderous and dangerous when he is rejected by Dr. Frankenstein. Of course, remember, Dr. Frankenstein created the monster because of his pride and his vanity and his sense that he was so much better than most of the other scientists at the time. And so he wanted to prove that he could create life. When all of his mentors were telling him that such a thing was impossible to do, he wanted to prove everybody wrong and to show how he was right. And so there's this kind of, again, a sense of egoism, of narcissism. This led to the creation of the monster. And when the monster is created, Frankenstein rejects him, and the monster tells Dr. Frankenstein in one of the Arctic encounters that it was Frankenstein that created him, and his rejection and his unwillingness to love and care for him that made him turn criminal, that he wasn't actually born that way. He was made that way by the lack of attention and caring and nurturing by Dr. Frankenstein. And so the monster is created because of the inadequacies of its creator, the senses of egoism, of narcissism, of incompetence and insecurity. You find that that kind of storyline filtering through all of these stories, particularly the main ones in episode 6 of Lower Decks. Now, for some people, this suggests then that technology and the tools that human beings build are things that we ought to think of as being value-free, that the monster or the data core or Badgie or control are not evil in and of themselves. It's technology becomes evil or good depending on the emotions or the motivations or the feelings of its creators, but that in itself, technology is value-free, right? So you might read all of these stories to say, well, you know, we have to work really hard to make sure that we're coming from a good place when we build technology, right? Technology is a tool, and if we have bad motivations going into it, it's going to turn out disastrous. Isn't that what Star Trek is telling us? I think that this is not actually the right way to think about technology either. I think that there are ways to understand technology that don't understand it as value-free. I think that, for instance, the work of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno in The Dialectic of the Enlightenment from 1947 tells us that technology, in fact, is not value-free. Right? Technology, in fact, has values built into it. Right? One of them being the idea of efficiency. One of the things that Horkheimer and Adorno argue in their book from 1947 is that the Enlightenment project of trying to control nature, of trying to dominate nature through science and technology, is one that comes from a sense of human beings wanting to dominate the earth and to get rid of all the forces that have told them that they are small and insignificant, superstition, religious belief, and so forth. And instead, in sort of the ways in which Thomas or Francis Bacon talked about science, was a way of mastering nature. This kind of led to a way of thinking that Horkheimer and Adorno called instrumental rationality, which is about means to ends. And so that in some sense, our scientific projects and our technological projects since the Enlightenment period have been about trying to find efficient ways to control and dominate nature for our own purposes. And so technology is not necessarily value-free. It's a way of thinking about developing tools to make things more efficient. Now, they were very concerned about the spread of this way of thinking throughout society and the ways in which particularly capitalism made efficiency and making things efficient be the end-all be-all of all kinds of interactions in society. I love this particular picture of Horkheimer and Adorno here in the front, because in the back, with the guy running his hands through his hair, that is Jürgen Habermas, of course, one of the great figures also of the 20th century Frankfurt School, and a student of Adorno, right? And Habermas follows up on some of this thinking by saying, yes, there is a big emphasis in the world today on this idea of instrumental rationality, or what he calls strategic rationality, strategic communication. There's an emphasis in being very means to end oriented, everything being about the most efficient way to make decisions. He finds a lot of this kind of way of thinking in the marketplace and in government relations, about getting down to the most barest kinds of benefit ways of thinking, what's going to create the best outcomes from the least amount of effort. And so Habermas, in some sense, says that this kind of way of thinking about efficiency, about instrumental rationality, about means ends thinking, has really come to dominate our government and our capitalist market system. And it starts to threaten to affect the ways in which we in our everyday lives and in our political lives think about interacting with one another. We're starting to see ways that he believed in which we are using other people for our own benefits. We see other people as means to our own ends. And of course, this has historically been been, right, from this tradition of German idealism, the road to a lot of immoral actions. And so efficiency in itself is not bad, but when you start to spread efficiency to all areas of life, you start to crowd out other ways of being able to make decisions. And of course, for Habermas, the alternative to this is what he calls communicative rationality. Talking and dialoguing in rational ways about our common world together that allows us to talk about other sorts of values that are not simply about means to end or the most efficient or the most cost benefit sort of analysis, but thinking about what kind of world that we want to live in, what kind of values do we want to have, and the more that instrumental rationality and efficiency are the driving forces, the less room we have for those kinds of discussions. So the sense here is that from these members of the Frankfurt School is that technology is not necessarily something that we ought to think of as being completely value-free. It has built into it the idea that one of its goals is to accomplish as much as efficiency as possible. So we need to be wary of thinking about technological fixes to most kinds of problems, right? There are a lot of different kinds of political, social, moral problems in the world that won't necessarily get solved simply because scientists can develop a new cure or a new piece of technology that can measure, that can distribute resources in a more efficient way. That there are certain kinds of moral and political problems that are not about developing more and better algorithms for the distribution of resources and so forth, but these are questions about what kinds of people and what kinds of societies we want to be. And so this raises, again, these kinds of questions that I think come from Frankenstein and that lead to all of the stories that we've seen in the Star Trek universe, is that technology has to be considered within the moral framework of human beings and what makes a good human being, and a recognition of the kinds of moral failings that we have as human beings that can really lead us to develop technologies in ways that might be dangerous to ourselves or to other human beings, right? Frankenstein, the monster, is not the evil being. The creature is not the monster. Dr. Frankenstein is the monster because he's a moral monster. And so we ought to understand the role of technology embedded in a larger sort of moral world. And this is, I think, the lessons that we come from with the Frankfurt School. Now, I think that you see this being recognized in the Star Trek universe in the next episode of Lower Decks, episode 7, Much Ado About Boimler. Right, there's a storyline that has to do with Rutherford again, really being fixated on this idea of efficiency. So we see him trying to make the transporter system on the USS Cerritos much more efficient by point something something second transport between one chamber and another. And what happens in this, of course, is that Boimler signs up for the experiment to try to improve the system, and he experiences a transporter malfunction in which he is phased out of reality. And so the initial sort of disaster is that he is in this kind of phased existence, making this really loud and annoying sound, the sound of the transporter that follows him everywhere. But I think that this story sort of recognizes the kinds of things that the Frankfurt School is telling us about technology, is that there's a danger in trying to pursue efficiency for efficiency's sake. Efficiency should not be the prime reason that we develop technology and use technology, the Frankfurt School tells us. Efficiency should always be within the context of other sorts of goals that we have in society. But there's a danger of pursuing efficiency for efficiency's sake. Now, this is kind of mitigated in the story, right? Because it turns out that Rutherford's experiments with the transporter save the day at the end. But again, I think this makes sense in the context that we're talking about here, is that technology should be efficient for the sake of saving people's lives, for instance. But when you pursue technology with the drive of just trying to make it much more efficient because you can you wind up like the disaster with Boimler. Now, in episode 7, there's another storyline that has to do with technology that I think is also really significant. This is where Ensign Tendi shows up, and she admits that in her spare time, when she's not doing all the rest of her work in sickbay, has taken some inert carbon and sequenced some DNA, and she's developed a unique life form, which she calls the dog. It's not a dog, it's the dog. That's the thing's name. So she decided that she wanted to build a dog like on Earth. Of course, remember, she's from Orion and they don't have dogs like this. And so she's really excited because she was able to genetically sequence a living being that follows her around, and she thinks that is incredibly cute. What's interesting about this storyline is that it's quite surprising in the first place that Tendi would be given the leeway to do this kind of research at all, given the way in which Star Trek has always had a strong feeling against any kind of genetic science. Of course, this going back to the original series, the Space Seed episode, in which we are introduced to perhaps one of the most arch villains of the Star Trek universe, Khan Noonien Singh, right, who is a genetic Superman from the 20th century, and he tries to take over the Enterprise. And of course, we see him again in Star Trek II, the movie, The Wrath of Khan, in which he comes back and he wreaks havoc again on the universe, killing Kirk's or leading to the death of Spock, and leading events to place that lead to Kirk's son's death, right? It's a huge disaster. In the Kelvin universe, right, he's again brought back, portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch, right? And so Khan is one of these really major figures in the Star Trek universe, but created by scientists in the 20th century who wanted to genetically enhance human beings. And what a disaster this would be. You see this this prohibition against genetic enhancement going through a lot of the different series, including the entire augment storyline in Star Trek Enterprise. And then of course it pops up again in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, in which we learn that Dr. Bashir was illegally enhanced by his parents, because it turns out that he wasn't particularly bright as a young person. And so his parents wanted the best for him. And so they had treatments given to him that enhanced him. And in the end, of course, they have to suffer severe prison time for their work. So in any case, it's really interesting that Tendi is able to do this kind of genetic work, given that the Star Trek universe has always warned that genetic enhancement technology is perhaps one of the most dangerous kinds of technologies that we can engage in, and has always had a prohibition against doing this kind of work. And this seems to be borne out in the story, right? Because it turns out that the dog is not a normal dog. He has he or she, it's not quite clear, right? But it has all of these capabilities that Earth dogs don't. It's able to modify its body. It's able to, we find out at the end, fly. It's able to talk, and it's able to spit lightning. And we find out that Tendi knew all of these kinds of things. She just didn't know that that's not what dogs did. But here again, you see this kind of storyline that screwing around with this kind of technology can lead to some really disastrous effects, or at least we think so. It turns out that the dog is a really nice creature, and it's really not a monster as it's seen here, right? Throughout most of the episode, it seems as though there's something kind of freakish or abnormal or even monstrous and dangerous about the dog. But it turns out that in the end of the episode, the dog is not a monster. Well, why not? Why isn't the dog like Khan or any of the other augments, right, who were, when they were genetically enhanced, let their abilities run forth and turn into these creatures that are fearful in the Star Trek, or that should be feared in the Star Trek universe? Well, I think that part of the reason that the dog doesn't turn into a monster in the ways that, for instance, Badgie did, or Control did, or M5 did, is because Tendi, the dog's creator, loved the dog. I think that this follows a kind of idea that comes from Bruno Latour. In 2011, Bruno Latour wrote an article, in some sense commemorating the writing of Frankenstein. And he follows along the thinking that I've been talking about here, is that the real monster in Frankenstein was not the creature, but Dr. Frankenstein. And the story is really trying to talk about, not about the dangers of science and technology, but about the danger of about the ways in which we engage or deal with science and technology. And what's interesting is that I think that this is mirrored in the story of Tendi and the dog. Tendi doesn't let the dog become a monster because she loves it, she cares for it, she treats it as something that deserves love and care from her. Right. Unlike Frankenstein and the monster, when Frankenstein saw what the monster, the creature, could do, he immediately rejected it. And of course, that sets the entire story along as a horror story. The dog doesn't become a horrible monster because Tendi tries to care for it. And this is what Latour says is of course, the moral lesson of Frankenstein, but it also should be a lesson about how we should approach thinking about technology and science. For Latour, there's a big sort of emphasis in environmentalism and other kinds of reactions to technology, genetic enhancement technology, GMOs and so forth, that say that these things are unnatural, and that the proper approach that we should have to thinking about nature and science and technology is that we should try to have as much of the world be natural as possible, and that our human science needs to just back off and let things be as natural as possible. He has big critiques, for instance, of American environmentalism, which is so fascinated with ideas of wilderness, right, and creating these kinds of wild spaces that we can keep pristine and preserve. Whereas he thinks that, for instance, in other places, for instance, in Europe, when we think about environmentalism, we think about lived environments, right? And so we don't make distinctions, he says, between the city and the wilderness, right? We think about a lived environment and think about how we can try to think about nature in that context. And he thinks that's a better way of approaching the idea of environmentalism, is this kind of sense about the human impact on the environment. And so part of this is he says we need to learn how to care for our creation. That is, we need to care for our science, and to think about our science and our technology as trying to be more integrated with the natural world, rather than thinking about science as the tool by which we will dominate and master the world. We can think about technology as ways in which we can better integrate with non-human animals and with the natural world. Now, I don't think that Latour is particularly unique and innovative in this particular kind of approach. I think that you see this kind of idea also expressed in the work of Aldo Leopold, his notions that we need to expand our moral focus to encompass not only non-human animals, but also, right, the living, breathing earth, and to think about the earth not as simply objects, but as living beings in an ecology. And the more that we can sort of think about ourselves in relationship to this ecology and see our place within this ecology, the better will be able to appreciate it, to care for it, and to be stewards of the land. I think you also see this kind of perspective coming out of Vandana Shiva and her idea of developing earth democracy, that we need to think about the earth not as resources for our use, in that sort of means and ends kinds of instrumental thinking that the Frankfurt School is so worried about. Instead, what we need to do is we need to think about the role of human beings as a part of nature, as related to other non-human animals, and as relying on the ecological balance of the earth, and to think about the earth as having a voice or a say, and as much as we can to try to be sensitive and to listen to what nature is telling us it needs. This has, of course, led Shiva to recommend things such as the work that's been done in Latin America with giving legal rights to nature, right? In the Bolivian and Ecuadorian constitutions, for instance, you find provisions that grant Mother Nature, Pachamama, a natural right to be represented in decisions about development. So instead of thinking about nature as just simply objects and dirt and resources for human use, you think of them as living, breathing agents that need to be in dialogue with us about our own needs. And we need to figure out how to balance our needs against those needs. And any kind of development, according to the Bolivian or the Ecuadorian constitution, cannot be done unless it takes into account those kinds of voices of nature. And so I think that what you see in episode 7 with the story of Tendi and the dog is this idea that science and genetic technology in and of itself may not necessarily be monstrous, but if it's done with a kind of an awareness and a willingness to love and to care for the creations and the work that we do with that science and technology, we'll be in a better position, right? We will not create monsters out of our work because we will have a better sense of our relationship to what nature needs. So I think that there are some interesting lessons that come out of these 2 episodes of The Lower Decks. One is that it's telling a complex story about technology, not as value neutral, but as recognizing that there are values built into technology. We need to be careful about making sure that we don't become so glamored and enamored by our technology that we start to think that anything that we can do to improve it is something that we ought to follow up. But that efficiency is always something that is one value amongst others that we need to balance in our human communities and our political calculus and decision makings about the kind of world that we want to build. We also ought to be clear about why we build the tools that we do and what kinds of motivations are going into the development of technology. Thinking about, for instance, M5 or Badgie and so forth, thinking about the fact that so much of our technology comes from development, research and development for military purposes, purposes of fear and insecurity. What would it mean to think about coming to research and development from other kinds of emotional and moral reactions? I think that these are the kinds of things that the Star Trek universe is trying to teach us. And then finally, this last lesson about Tendi and the dog. We need to think a little bit about our role in the natural world, our role to non-human animals, and to think more sophisticated ways about how we engage in some kind of balance between our needs and the needs of non-human animals and the needs of our natural ecology. There have been a lot of different thinkers and philosophers who've been engaging and warning us about our failure to do this kind of sophisticated thinking. As I mentioned, Bruno Latour, Aldo Leopold, Vandana Shiva. But I think that the story in episode 7 of Tendi and the dog reinforces this kind of lesson. So I think that what we've seen with these 2 episodes of The Lower Decks is some really, really interesting, sophisticated philosophical thinking about the role of science and technology in our world that has continuity to other Star Trek stories. And so the whole argument that you see going on in many spaces that somehow Lower Decks is not canon, I think is wrong, because it actually, you see these stories reinforcing lessons that come from other earlier series. But you also see some new emphases in these stories that suggest some really kinds of sophisticated ideas about how we ought to think about the role of technology in our ethical and political world. And so I really recommend people check out Lower Decks. I think that the animation is really cool. I think the stories are fun. My kids love it. But I also think that Lower Decks so far going into it maintains the tradition of offering us some really insightful and enticing stories about how to think about our place in the world with science, technology, and exploration of who we are as human beings. So let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. Tell us what you think about Lower Decks if you've seen it. What do you think about the ways in which science and technology have been portrayed in these two episodes? We are the Anarres Project. If you would like to get a hold of us, you can find us on social media at Anarres Project on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. You can also find us at our website, which is anarresproject.org. We'd love to hear from you. While you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch some of the other ways in which we've explored both Star Wars and Star Trek, helping us to understand things like philosophical wisdom and other developments in our political and social world. Drop us a line and tell us what you think. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to be able to continue the conversation. And we'd love to hear about what kinds of topics that you would like us to continue to think about. Thanks once again, and hope that we hear from you. Live long and prosper.